The neighborhood was known for its serene streets and perfectly manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved as they drove by, and everyone followed the rules to keep things looking pristine. But everything changed the moment the new HOA president Karen moved in. She was the type of person who believed she had an innate right to control everything around her, from the exact shade of the flowers in the garden to the way the front doors were painted. She immediately started walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, making notes about what was wrong with everyone's property. Even the tiniest details were scrutinized. Nothing was ever good enough for her, and soon she began sending out notices to homeowners, informing them of the changes they needed to make to comply with her standards. The protagonist had lived in the neighborhood for years. They were the quiet neighbor who kept to themselves and never caused any trouble. Their house was simple but well kept, the lawn was trimmed, and the paint on the house was fresh but not overly bright or obnoxious, just enough to blend in with the rest of the homes. The protagonist had always believed in following the rules. They respected the HOA guidelines and felt like they didn't need to change anything unless it was absolutely necessary. But Karen had a different vision for the neighborhood. She believed that everything had to be picture perfect. Every house had to fit into her idealized version of suburban bliss. The first letter from Karen came like a shock. It was a formal notice saying the protagonist's property didn't meet the HOA's expectations and demanded that changes be made within 30 days. Specifically, the letter claimed the lawn wasn't edged properly and the color of the shutters didn't match the official shade approved by the HOA. The protagonist was confused. They had never received a complaint before. Their lawn had always been maintained, and the shutters were the same color they'd been since they moved in, so they thought it must have been some mistake. They decided to ignore the letter, thinking maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But then came the second letter. This time, it was more forceful, demanding immediate action and threatening legal consequences if the changes weren't made by the deadline. The protagonist tried to reach out to Karen directly, but when they called, Karen was unavailable, and the only response they got was another letter saying the same thing, only harsher. Now, they began to feel a sense of unease. This wasn't just a friendly reminder anymore. It was a threat, and it was clear that Karen wouldn't back down. The protagonist wasn't the type to engage in conflict, but this felt different. It wasn't just about following rules, it was about being forced into submission by someone who clearly thought they had all the power in the world to dictate everyone's lives. But the protagonist was determined not to let Karen get away with it. They spent the next few days researching HOA laws and regulations, reading up on every document they could find to understand what Karen's rights actually were, and if the HOA had any real authority to force changes or evict homeowners. It became clear to the protagonist that Karen had overstepped her boundaries. She wasn't following the correct procedures, and her threats were nothing more than empty words. But the more the protagonist uncovered, the more they realized they couldn't just sit back and let this happen. Karen had already made it clear that she was out for blood and would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. The protagonist had to act quickly before things escalated even further. They began to formulate a plan to fight back and stand up for their rights in the neighborhood, not knowing that this would turn into a battle of wits that would shake the community to its core. The protagonist wasn't the type to seek confrontation, but the way Karen had approached the situation left them with no choice. They had to fight back. The more they thought about the situation, the more they realized this wasn't just about a lawn or some shutters. This was about control. Karen was trying to assert her dominance over everyone in the neighborhood, and the protagonist wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Karen's relentless letters were becoming more and more frequent, each one escalating in severity. The latest one even threatened eviction and legal action if they didn't comply immediately. The protagonist couldn't believe what they were reading. They had done everything by the book and followed all the HOA guidelines, yet here was this woman telling them they had no choice but to change everything about their house or face eviction. The idea of eviction seemed laughable at first. They didn't think for a second that the HOA had the power to remove them from their home. But as the days went by and Karen's threats grew more vicious, they began to feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for themselves and their rights. Karen's behavior had started to feel like an attack on their entire existence. As a member of the neighborhood, the protagonist was starting to realize the community they had once thought of as peaceful was being torn apart by this one woman's thirst for power. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was trying to break people's spirits and force them into submission. But the protagonist wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. They had spent years building their life here, and they weren't about to let Karen destroy it. They needed to take action, but they also needed to make sure they were in the right. The protagonist spent the next few days buried in research, diving deep into HOA regulations, reading through pages of bylaws and legal documents. They wanted to be armed with knowledge before they made any move. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. If they were going to stand up to Karen, they needed to know the rules inside and out. They quickly learned that Karen had overstepped her bounds. Not only had she misinterpreted the HOA guidelines, but she had also made several errors in the way she was handling the situation. First off, she didn't have the authority to force anyone to make changes to their property unless it was in clear violation of the HOA guidelines, and even then she was required to issue warnings and follow a specific process. Karen had skipped several steps and was jumping straight to threats of eviction and legal action. This discovery made the protagonist feel a sense of relief, but it also made them angry. They had been bullied for no reason by someone who didn't even understand the rules they had been following for years. It wasn't just a simple mistake, it was an abuse of power, and they couldn't let it slide. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down, so neither could they. It was time to take action. The protagonist knew they couldn't do this alone, so they reached out to a few trusted neighbors who had also been dealing with Karen's unreasonable demands. They began to discuss their options and brainstorm ways to confront Karen without escalating things too much. They knew they had to approach this carefully. They didn't want to make things worse by getting into a full-blown confrontation with Karen, but they also couldn't let her continue to make their lives miserable. They decided to attend the next HOA meeting together, armed with the knowledge they had gathered and ready to stand up for their rights. As homeowners, they weren't going to let Karen continue to bully them or anyone else in the neighborhood. They were determined to make sure she understood that no one was going to let her get away with it anymore. Karen had made the mistake of underestimating them, and now she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The protagonist was ready to face Karen head on and reclaim control of their neighborhood before Karen could do any more damage. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the protagonist felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. They had spent days preparing for this moment, gathering every bit of information they could find to prove that Karen was in the wrong. They had spoken to neighbors who had also been harassed by her, and together they had compiled a list of complaints that would expose Karen's abuses of power. The protagonist knew that this meeting would be their chance to finally confront Karen face to face and put an end to her reign of terror. The meeting room was filled with familiar faces of neighbors who had also grown tired of Karen's overbearing presence. As they filed in, the protagonist noticed Karen sitting at the front of the room, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She was clearly expecting things to go her way as usual, but the protagonist wasn't going to let that happen. They took a seat near the back of the room, but made sure they were within earshot of Karen. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time diving into her agenda. She started talking about how the neighborhood had fallen into disarray in her eyes and how there were homeowners who weren't following the HOA guidelines properly. She went on and on about how certain properties weren't up to her standard and how changes needed to be made to keep the neighborhood from declining. In her eyes, it was all about control. She didn't care about the real rules. She just wanted things to fit her vision of what a perfect neighborhood looked like. When Karen finally opened the floor to complaints, the protagonist stood up and made their way to the front of the room. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone knew what was coming. Karen looked at them with a mixture of surprise and annoyance, but the protagonist wasn't intimidated. They had rehearsed this moment in their mind 1,000 times, and now it was time to speak the truth. Calmly and confidently, they began by addressing the fact that Karen's behavior had been completely out of line. They explained how they had followed the HOA guidelines to the letter and had never received any complaints before Karen took over. They pointed out that the lawn and shutters in question were not in violation of any rules, and that Karen's claims were nothing more than personal preferences, not actual regulations. The protagonist then dropped the bombshell that Karen had overstepped her authority as the HOA president by threatening eviction and legal action when there was no basis for it. The room went quiet as everyone listened intently. Karen's face turned red as she realized that she had been caught in her lies. But she tried to save face by brushing it off and making excuses. She claimed that she was just trying to keep the neighborhood looking nice and that she was doing what was best for everyone, but the protagonist wasn't buying it. They pointed out that Karen's actions had caused unnecessary stress and division in the community, and that she had been making unreasonable demands without following proper procedure. Then the protagonist shifted gears and pointed out that Karen's own property was in violation of several HOA rules. She had failed to maintain her own lawn properly and had ignored several other guidelines for home upkeep that she had been trying to enforce on others. The shock in the room was palpable as people began to realize that Karen wasn't even following the very rules she had been trying to impose on everyone else. The protagonist made it clear that they weren't there to start a fight, they were simply asking for fairness and respect. Karen's grip on control over the neighborhood was starting to slip, and the other neighbors were starting to see through her act. Karen's defense grew weaker as the meeting went on, and it was clear that the tide was turning in the protagonist's favor. The protagonist stood tall, knowing that they had done the right thing. They had exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind a facade of authority. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen would have to face the consequences for her actions, and the protagonist would make sure of that. As the meeting progressed, Karen's confidence started to waver. She tried to brush off the accusations, but the room was no longer on her side. The more the protagonist spoke, the more the other neighbors began to take notice. They had seen the way Karen acted before, but now it was clear to them that she had been abusing her power for far too long. The protagonist didn't back down. They calmly continued, laying out the facts, showing how Karen's actions had broken the rules and caused unnecessary stress to the community. They pointed out specific instances where Karen had overstepped and threatened eviction without cause. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but the protagonist stayed focused and made sure everyone in the room understood the gravity of the situation. The longer Karen tried to defend herself, the more ridiculous her excuses sounded. The truth was right there in front of everyone, and they could no longer ignore it. Karen had been using her position to push her personal agenda and hurt those around her. The neighbors who had previously kept quiet were now speaking up one by one. They shared their own experiences of Karen's unreasonable demands and harsh tactics. They explained how Karen had pressured them to change things about their homes that didn't even violate any HOA rules. They all spoke with a sense of frustration that had been building up for months or even years, as Karen's behavior had gotten worse with each passing day. The meeting room, which had once been tense and full of quiet submission, was now filled with an air of defiance as the neighbors stood together against Karen's control over them. The protagonist felt a sense of relief and pride as they watched their neighbors finally finding their voice. They were no longer alone in this fight. They had sparked a change in the community, and it was clear that Karen's power was slipping away with every word spoken in her defense. The more Karen tried to defend her actions, the more people turned against her. It was becoming impossible for her to save face. She was no longer the confident HOA president who could dictate everyone's lives with a smile. She was now a woman backed into a corner with nowhere to go. The protagonist didn't let up. They continued to press the issue, pointing out the violations on Karen's own property and reminding the room that Karen had been the one to threaten eviction without a legal basis. They weren't about to let her get away with it. They knew that they had to push harder to make sure Karen would face the consequences for what she had done. But just when it seemed like Karen was about to crumble, she tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. She stood up and tried to shout over the others. She accused the protagonist of trying to ruin the neighborhood and called them disrespectful for challenging her authority. But this only further alienated her from the rest of the group. The more Karen tried to take control, the more the room rejected her. Everyone had seen her true colors, And there was no going back after this. The protagonist saw the moment they had been waiting for. They knew they had to take the final step and expose Karen for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind a mask of authority. They stepped forward once more and reminded everyone in the room that Karen had no right to demand anything from anyone without following the correct procedures. They called for her resignation as HOA president and made it clear that she no longer had the trust or support of the community. Karen stood there fuming and red-faced, unable to do anything as the meeting moved forward. Without her, the protagonist knew they had won, but they also knew this battle wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly, and they had to be ready for whatever she would do next. But for now, they could enjoy the victory. The community had stood together, and they had brought down the person who had been tormenting them for so long. The protagonist had taken a stand, and they had shown everyone that the power of one voice could change everything. After the meeting ended, the protagonist could hardly believe what had just transpired. Karen had been forced to step down, and the community had rallied behind them in a way they never expected. It felt surreal. The protagonist had spent so long being quiet and staying out of the drama that they never imagined they'd be the one to bring about such a change. They felt a rush of adrenaline and relief wash over them as they left the meeting room with their neighbors, some of whom patted them on the back, others offered words of thanks and congratulations. The protagonist was overwhelmed by the support. But they also knew that this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to take this loss easily, and they couldn't let their guard down just yet. The next few days were tense. Karen had gone silent for a while, and no one was sure what she was planning. The protagonist stayed on edge, constantly wondering if Karen would retaliate or try to cause more trouble for them or the neighborhood. But as the days passed, it became clear that Karen was not going to give up. Without a fight, she started showing up unannounced at the protagonist's door, sometimes with legal papers and sometimes with accusations of slander. Karen claimed that the protagonist had lied about her and that she was going to take legal action against them for defamation. She even threatened to go to the press and make a big spectacle out of the whole thing, hoping to ruin the protagonist's reputation. But the protagonist wasn't intimidated this time. They knew they had done nothing wrong, and they weren't going to let Karen's empty threats scare them into submission. They calmly turned away every attempt Karen made to engage with them, and when Karen tried to go to the press, the protagonist reached out to their neighbors to make sure the story would be told correctly. The community was behind them, and they were ready to stand their ground against Karen's manipulation. Karen quickly realized that the support she once had was gone, and the people she thought she could control were now united against her. As the weeks went on, Karen's tactics grew more desperate. She tried to gather a few allies from other neighborhoods and convince them to join her fight, but the majority of the community had already made up their minds. They wanted nothing to do with her. They didn't trust her, and they were done with her antics. Karen's reputation had been thoroughly damaged by her own actions, and there was no way to fix it. She had alienated herself from everyone around her. The protagonist watched as the once powerful HOA president lost more and more of her influence with every passing day. Karen tried to salvage what was left of her position by making a few attempts to reach out to other HOA members, but those attempts were swiftly rejected. No one wanted to back her up anymore. Her credibility had been completely destroyed by her abuse of power and her relentless harassment of the neighborhood. Karen's downfall was a slow process, but it was inevitable, and the protagonist was ready to watch it unfold. They didn't want to see anyone suffer, but Karen had crossed too many lines for them to feel sympathy for her. They had to remind themselves that this was about justice and fairness, not vengeance. After all, the protagonist had never asked for any of this. They had just wanted to live peacefully in their home, but Karen's decision to attack them and others in the neighborhood had forced their hand. They were now at the point where they had no choice but to keep fighting for what was right. And the more Karen fought, the more her own actions would come back to haunt her. The protagonist knew that the battle wasn't truly over, but the tide had definitely turned in their favor. They had become a symbol of resistance in the neighborhood, and every day they felt more confident in their ability to protect their home, and the community that had supported them through it all. Despite Karen's attempts To make their lives difficult, the protagonist had won the most important battle of all. They had gained the respect of their neighbors and proven that standing up for what's right could change everything. Weeks passed, and Karen's attempts to regain any kind of control over the neighborhood grew more futile. Every time she tried to stir up trouble, she was met with resistance from the neighbors, who were now firmly united against her. They no longer feared her authority, and the grip she once had on the community had dissolved into nothing more than a bitter memory. Karen had no choice but to retreat further into herself. Her house was now a symbol of her failure. Every time someone drove by it was a reminder of how far she had fallen. She spent more and more time behind closed doors, and fewer people came to visit her. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. A sense of freedom and relief had settled in as everyone went about their lives without the looming presence of someone trying to control them. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of pride knowing they had been a part of the change that had taken place. Despite everything they had gone through, they had stood firm and had brought about a transformation, not just for themselves but for everyone in the neighborhood. Even the neighbors who hadn't directly been affected by Karen's actions felt the shift. The community had become stronger, more connected, and more willing to stand up for what was right. They had seen firsthand the power of unity and the importance of speaking out against injustice. The protagonist's reputation within the neighborhood had shifted as well. They were no longer the quiet person who kept to themselves. They were now seen as a leader, a symbol of resistance to unfair authority. People started coming to them for advice or help with issues that came up in the neighborhood. They had earned the respect of their peers, and it felt good to know that their actions had made a lasting impact. But the protagonist wasn't about to let this go to their head. They remained humble, knowing that they had only done what needed to be done. They were not looking for recognition or praise. They simply wanted to live in a community where everyone felt safe and respected. They kept a low profile and continued to enjoy the peace that had returned to the neighborhood. Yet, despite the growing peace, the protagonist knew that Karen was still out there, lurking and plotting her next move. It was impossible for someone like her to accept defeat without trying to find a way to get back in control. She had already shown how far she was willing to go to try and intimidate others, and it was only a matter of time before she would strike again. The protagonist was ready, though they had learned the power of standing up for themselves, and they had the support of their neighbors. If Karen tried anything again, they would be ready to confront her head on. It wasn't just about protecting themselves, it was about protecting the neighborhood and everything they had fought for. The protagonist was no longer afraid of Karen or the power she once held in the community. They had taken down the bully and stood tall in the face of adversity, and they knew that if Karen came back, they would not back down. They would fight for what was right and ensure that their neighborhood remained a place where everyone was free to live peacefully without fear of intimidation or control. But for now, things were calm, and the protagonist had earned the peace they had worked so hard for. The neighborhood was beginning to heal, and it was clear that the spirit of unity was stronger than ever. The protagonist looked out over their neighborhood and couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. They had fought for change, and they had won. It was a victory that would not be forgotten anytime soon. As the months passed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. Things were quieter now, with Karen's absence from the HOA meetings and the community events. The protagonist could finally enjoy the peace they had fought so hard for. It was as if the weight that had been pressing down on everyone for so long had been lifted. But that didn't mean life was entirely without challenges. As the community grew closer together, there were still small issues that needed to be addressed. But this time there was a sense of unity and cooperation among the neighbors. No one was afraid to speak up or voice their concerns, and the protagonist had become a trusted voice in these discussions. Their neighbors had seen firsthand how standing up for what was right could make a difference, and they were ready to take action when needed. There were new faces in the neighborhood who had heard the story of how Karen had tried to take control and how the protagonist had led the charge to remove her from power. These newcomers were grateful for the peaceful atmosphere and were eager to contribute to the community. They quickly found themselves becoming part of the close-knit group that had formed as a result of the battle with Karen. The protagonist had become somewhat of an informal leader. They weren't looking for the title, but their actions had spoken for themselves, and people trusted them to help guide the neighborhood forward. They had proven that one person's voice could spark a change and that collective action could turn the tide. When the community faced adversity, the protagonist felt a sense of fulfillment in knowing that they had played a part in making their home a better place. They weren't in it for the accolades, but seeing how the neighborhood had transformed was enough to make them feel proud of what they had achieved. They still kept a low profile and continued to enjoy their life without the constant fear of conflict hanging over them, but they knew the lessons learned during the battle with Karen would stay with them forever. They had learned the importance of standing up for oneself and others. They had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks and facing challenges head on. And most importantly, they had learned that when people come together, they can accomplish great things. While the protagonist had hoped that Karen would eventually leave the neighborhood behind for good, that wasn't quite what happened. Karen didn't take her loss in stride. Instead, she quietly tried to keep herself isolated from the rest of the community, but her bitterness still lingered. She never fully let go of the anger and resentment that had built up over the months. As her power faded, Karen had retreated into a sort of quiet warmth, keeping to herself and occasionally sending snide remarks or passive-aggressive comments through the HOA bulletin or in passing conversations with neighbors. She was no longer in charge, but she still tried to manipulate things from the sidelines. It wasn't as effective as it once was, but it was clear she wasn't ready to accept her defeat and move on. It wasn't that the protagonist was concerned about Karen's continued bitterness, it was more about the fact that her negative energy still had the potential to affect the community in small ways. If left unchecked, the protagonist knew that Karen's resentment could quietly poison the well of unity that had been so carefully cultivated by the neighborhood, so they continued to keep an eye on her, watching for any signs that she might try to cause trouble again. The protagonist had learned the importance of vigilance, but they also knew that they couldn't let Karen's shadow overhang the future of the community. They had already won once, and if the need arose again, they would be ready to stand up for what was right this time, though they would do it together with the support of a united neighborhood that had learned the power of standing up for each other and for what was right. As time went on, Karen's attempts to interfere became less frequent, but still there were moments when her bitterness flared up in subtle ways. The protagonist stayed alert and made sure to keep an open line of communication with their neighbors. Whenever Karen made an underhanded comment or tried to cause discord, they were quick to address it, no longer willing to let her negative energy fester in the community. It was clear to the protagonist and the rest of the neighborhood that Karen was never going to fully let go of her past actions, but they weren't going to let her poison the peace they had worked so hard to restore. The protagonist continued to take on a quiet leadership role, organizing community meetings and helping resolve any minor conflicts that came up. They worked hard to make sure everyone felt heard and respected. It was an effort to maintain the harmony that had been built after Karen's reign of terror ended, and the protagonist was committed to ensuring it stayed that way. They knew that with a little effort and dedication, the neighborhood could continue to thrive as a strong, united community without the fear of one person controlling everything. They had learned how important it was to foster communication and understanding among their neighbors, and now it had become second nature for them to encourage collaboration instead of division. The protagonist also made sure to keep an eye on Karen's actions. Though she no longer had any real power, it was hard for the protagonist to ignore the fact that she still occasionally tried to make her presence known at HOA meetings or community events. Karen would sometimes show up uninvited, trying to stir up trouble with passive-aggressive remarks or complaints about how things were being run. Though she had lost the support of the majority of the community, she still showed up, hoping for an opportunity to regain some control over the neighborhood. But her presence was now met with cold indifference from most of the neighbors. They had seen what she was capable of, and they weren't willing to allow her to interfere again. Whenever Karen attempted to undermine the new sense of unity that had taken root, the protagonist and their neighbors made sure to shut it down quickly and decisively. Karen's attempts to disrupt the peace became more and more transparent. She would sometimes try to talk behind people's backs or spread rumors about decisions being made But the more she tried to pit people against each other, the less effective it became. The community was stronger now, and they weren't fooled by her tactics anymore. The protagonist watched as Karen slowly became more isolated from the neighborhood. Her attempts to manipulate people grew increasingly desperate and empty. She had lost her audience, and the more she tried to stir the pot, the more she realized no one was listening to her anymore. The protagonist could sense that Karen was finally starting to realize that her time in the spotlight was over, and she had nothing left to hold on to. She had no power and no allies, and it was a bitter pill for her to swallow. At first, it seemed like Karen might leave on her own. But then she did something unexpected. One day, Karen walked up to the protagonist's house with a letter in hand and asked if they could talk. It was clear that she had come to make peace, or at least attempt to. After all this time of causing trouble, Karen had finally realized that she wasn't going to win the battle of control she had fought for so long. Instead, she was faced with the reality that she had alienated everyone and that her only option left was to try and rebuild some semblance of respect. She sat down with the protagonist and began to apologize for her past behavior. She admitted that she had let power go to her head and that she had been wrong to treat people the way she had. She said she regretted the way she had tried to tear the community apart and that she wanted to make amends. It was a moment of vulnerability for Karen, one that no one had ever expected to see, especially after all the harm she had caused. But the protagonist remained cautious. They had seen Karen's manipulation firsthand, and they weren't sure if this apology was sincere or just another attempt to regain control. Karen's sincerity remained in question, but for the first time in a long time, it seemed that the possibility of reconciliation might be on the horizon. The protagonist listened carefully. They understood the complexity of human nature and knew that everyone had the capacity to change. But they also knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. They didn't give Karen an immediate response, but instead told her that they needed time to process everything they had been through and to see if Karen's actions would truly match her words. The protagonist knew that it would take much more than a few words to undo the damage Karen had caused, but perhaps there was a chance that with enough time and effort, the neighborhood could heal completely, and Karen could find a way to reintegrate into the community on new terms. Only time would tell. Weeks passed after Karen's unexpected visit to the protagonist, and the neighborhood began to settle into its new normal. The protagonist was cautious about how to approach the situation. They had seen too many sides of Karen to trust her immediately, but they also understood that people could change and that the community had to move forward if it was ever going to heal completely. Karen did her best to stay out of the spotlight. She didn't try to reassert any kind of control, and for a while she kept a low profile. It was as if she had finally accepted that her reign was over and that she was no longer welcome in the position of power she once held. Karen's behavior changed over time. She stopped attending HOA meetings uninvited and stopped trying to meddle in the decisions that were being made for the neighborhood. The protagonist saw this as a sign that she might be genuinely trying to change, though they remained vigilant in case she decided to revert to her old ways. The protagonist continued to focus on the community and the growth it had experienced since the days of Karen's rule. They kept fostering a sense of collaboration and trust between their neighbors, and soon the neighborhood became a model for how communities could function when everyone worked together and communicated openly. The protagonist had a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing the changes that had occurred. They had fought for this peace and unity, and it had paid off. The neighborhood was thriving, and the sense of security that had once been lost had returned. Karen continued to show up at occasional social gatherings, but she no longer tried to take center stage or draw attention to herself. She interacted with others in the neighborhood with a quiet humility and seemed to be genuinely trying to move past the mistakes of her past. But the protagonist remained cautious. They knew that actions spoke louder than words, and they had seen firsthand how easily Karen could manipulate a situation to serve her own interests. They were careful not to let their guard down completely, but they also didn't want to create an atmosphere of constant suspicion. Either they wanted to see if Karen's new behavior was real or if it was just a facade. They observed her closely during the months that followed and saw that Karen seemed to be sticking to her word. She wasn't causing any more trouble or trying to sow discord between the neighbors. She was doing her best to fit in and accept the changes in the community while still maintaining a quiet distance from the things she had once controlled. The protagonist couldn't deny that Karen's efforts to make amends were noticeable. There was no more manipulation, no more attempts to disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. It seemed like she had truly learned a lesson about power and control, and about how important it was to respect the people around her. But despite the changes in Karen's behavior, the protagonist knew that things could never go back to how they were before. The scars of her past actions had left a permanent mark on the community, and no amount of apology could erase the hurt she had caused. The protagonist had forgiven Karen for their part, but they also knew that the neighborhood could never fully forget the damage that had been done. They would remain watchful and vigilant, but they had to be realistic about what could be rebuilt and what had been permanently altered. It was clear that Karen was trying to find her place in the new order of things, but the protagonist and the rest of the neighborhood would never forget how far Karen had pushed her power for their sake, and how many people had been hurt in the process. As much as the protagonist hoped that the neighborhood could continue to grow and thrive, they knew it would always carry a shadow of what had happened. The experience had changed everyone in some way, and it had shown them the importance of standing up for what was right and the power of unity in the face of adversity. Even as the protagonist watched Karen slowly integrate into the community again, they knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down completely, but they also couldn't let the past define them forever. They had worked too hard to get to this point, and they weren't going to let it slip away now. For the first time in a long time, the protagonist felt like they could finally look to the future without the fear of what might come next. They had faced down a bully, they had fought for justice, and they had won. The neighborhood was theirs to protect now, and the protagonist was ready to continue leading the way, making sure that the lessons they had learned would never be forgotten, and that the peace they had fought so hard for would always remain.